So, this chapter is called Principles of Ecology, and it starts with a great question in this very thorny tree, which I believe is an acacia tree, which are very common in Africa, although you see them sometimes here. Why would a bird build its nest in such a thorny place? Like, such a horrible place. It actually appears that the nest is upside down or sideways. Why would a bird do that? Think about that for a little bit, and then maybe we'll talk about it later. If I remember, I hope I remember. Um, so, organisms in ecology, that is the study of how organisms interact with each other and with the environment. And it's a great type of science. I love it. It's very, very complicated. One of those that you will never know all of the answers. But here are some great milestones in ecology and conservation. Theodore Roosevelt did a ton to start our whole national parks program. He was so important. And without his very forward thinking, we would not have some wonderful places that we have, like Yosemite and others that we're so lucky to have. Rachel Carson was a very important female ecologist that published Silent Springs, which talked about like the different springs where there's water in a little ecosystem, but everything was dead. And this was during the 60s, and there was a lot of pesticides being put out with not a lot of background information, and it was very important. And she really highlighted the importance of, hey, should we look at these things? So there's really cool things. Different conservationists and different species, even near us in California, that are being saved. So look through this as you move through. So our planet, the whole thing, is called the biosphere. And it's basically the whole part of the earth that supports life is called the biosphere. It is huge. It's essentially the whole earth. And there's just all kinds of, there's crazy things that live near vents in the ocean, near boiling temperatures, near in acidic environment, like acid environments, like in Yellowstone. Then there's beautiful rainforests and as dry as can be at a desert, and yet there's life. Our biosphere is amazing. So biotic means all living things or living factors. So when you're out in an ecosystem, basically the living parts of it, the animals and the plants, the insects, even the bacteria, are all living things that interact. There's a different type of factor called an abiotic factor. An abiotic factor is basically the non-living things. So in this picture, what are some of the living things that you can see or can't see but are probably part of this environment? Some of the living things are probably the deer. There's probably some fish. I'm sure there's fungus. There's plants. You can see a tree here. So what are the abiotic parts, the non-living things that you can see here that are affecting this environment? So that could be like the water, the air, the wind, the rocks, the soil are all like non-living things or abiotic things that are affecting this ecosystem. So also in an ecosystem, you have something called a limiting factor. A limiting factor is basically something that just stops or restricts the growth of an organism in some way. So basically, a limiting factor for maybe your family is that maybe your parents, maybe didn't, stopped having kids because it was too expensive, or they didn't have space, or they, um, something like that. You can't fit any more kids in the car. Maybe the limiting factor for goldfish in a tank is that once you have so many, there's just, urine goes up.Maybe there's not enough food to support them all. What would be the limiting factor of orangutans in a rainforest? Maybe it would be that they need a certain amount of home range to live. Maybe they need a certain amount of food. Maybe there's not enough trees and the rainforest is small, so they literally can't have any more because it's too small. So, a limiting factor is something that basically limits or restricts the amount that can live there. Another thing is called the range of tolerance. Here's a great graph, or not a graph. It's sort of like an illustration of the range of tolerance. So here's a group of, I think they said it was steelhead trout. Yep, steelhead trout. And you can see that between the temperature of 13 and 21 degrees Celsius, most fish can grow, and somewhere right towards the middle you get the most fish. So somewhere between 13 and 21, maybe like 16 or so, 17 in there, you get the best growth of steelhead trout. Well, if you go below 13, you start to really decrease to where you don't have any more steelhead, and below 9 they won't even live at all. But above 21 they also start to really slow down, and at 20, after 25 degrees, none live. So this is like the optimum range. This is the best range. Between 13 and 21 is the best, with the very best being maybe 16 and a half or so. But then the range of tolerance is like, what's the lowest you could go before it dies, and what's the hottest you can go before it dies? So optimum range is different between what it can tolerate. So humans, maybe the optimum range for you is, what's your perfect temperature? What is your perfect temperature? Maybe for me, I like it a little warmer than most people. So I'd say 75 or so is my favorite temperature. Other people would maybe say 70. Some people like it colder. They're saying like 65, but that's their optimal. But what's the lowest you could leave me outside, or what's the hottest you could leave me outside before I die? I don't know. But it's different than what the optimal is. So this is called the range of tolerance and the optimal range. So the levels of organizations in species. There are organisms. An individual organism is one steelhead trout. A population is a whole group of steelhead trout. Then above that is a community, and a community is like groups of different fish and different things that are occupying the same area, the same niche at the same time. And then it goes bigger than that. The ecosystem is all of the living and non-living things. Let me go back to this picture here. The ecosystem is all of the alive, the biotic, and the abiotic things together is the ecosystem. So this is like a pond or a lake ecosystem. Maybe it's a stream. I don't know. Ecosystem. So it's all the living things like the deer, and all of the non-living things, including the rocks. And then above an ecosystem is a biome, meaning the whole area, the big giant climate. Like, instead of it just being this little lake, you're talking about this whole forest region would be the biome, and then above that is the biosphere. Okay, let me get back to where I was. So they break this down. Here you have one singular fish. I don't see the type of fish that is. I should probably know, but I do not. And then above that is a population, like a bunch of that kind of fish. And then above that is the biological community, where there's lots of living and non-living or I'm sorry, only the living organisms are the biological community. And then the ecosystem is the living and the non-living things. Then we go above that, and we are at a biome here, and then like a biosphere is the whole thing. Okay, so then we have interactions in an ecosystem. So here you have a whole community of trees in a forest. A habitat is one little place that an organism lives. So if you have a big organism like a bear, he might live all over this whole forest is his habitat. But you could have something really small like a spider that's living on his habitat is just a single branch of this tree. From there, you also have something called a niche. A niche is an organism's one role that they play in an ecosystem. So it's their little job or their little part of that community. So say a rat in a city, um, that rat's goal in the city and or niche that it plays is it picks up trash and it leaves waste different places, and maybe it hides out in like the wall of an old building. That's its little niche or ecological role in the community. Um, then there are interactions where there's competition between organisms for the same thing. You can see here in this watering hole, there's going to be a lot of competition. Maybe this baby elephant gets along with the giraffes just fine, but it's not going to go very well. You can see these giraffes looking in every direction. They're looking for a predator because they're going to want the water too. And that brings us to predators. Predators will actually eat other organisms. They will eat other organisms, and other organisms that are prey know that they could get eaten at any point. There's a certain type of interaction when two organisms kind of depend on each other in some way or interact with each other in some way, and that is called a symbiosis. A lot of times people think symbiosis means that both organisms are happy, like this happy looking sloth, but in symbiosis, it just means the two are interacting. It doesn't mean that they're both happy or one's happy and the other one's not. The way that a certain type of symbiosis where both are happy are called mutualism. Mutualism is when both species benefit from each other being there. So one symbiotic relationship is maybe with coral and the plankton that lives inside of the coral for protection. So the plankton lives inside the coral for protection, but the coral can't actually make enough food for itself. So the zooplankton is a type of plankton that makes energy, and it gives the coral some of that extra energy. So the coral has enough food, and the plankton has a safe place to live. So here is a sloth, and you can see that it is covered in this green algae. Well, this is a different type. Commensalism, I would say this is kind of like commensalism, but your book is putting it in, I believe it is putting it in mutualism. Let me see why. The sloth's fur absorbs water easily, providing it with algae. In return, the sloth receives camouflage. Oh, so this sloth is getting camouflage from the algae that's growing on it. And I guess that sloth thinks he looks like a leaf right now, but I just want to pick him up and okay. So commensalism is where one thing benefits and the other one isn't hurt or harmed. I don't really think there's very many commensalistic like relationships. Your book kind of says that maybe moss growing up a tree is commensalism, where the tree isn't hurt by that, but the moss gets to be up closer to the sun. I still think even in that relationship, that the tree has to hold the moss and maybe gets deteriorated a little bit because of the moss over time. So I don't know. I don't see too many commensalistic relationships, but we will move on from there and just not debate it. The next one is parasitism, and this makes me feel so bad for this tomato horn um, uh, worm. And these tomato horn worms drive me crazy because they get all over my tomato plants. You've maybe seen them before, but these are wasp eggs that have been laid all over this tomato hornworm, and the baby wasps will hatch and eat this tomato hornworm alive, which makes me sad for this tomato hornworm. This is called a parasitism. Okay. And you can also have parasites in our bodies. But there's some different things here where it talks about different parasites. Go and read that in your book. And that's all I have to go over in this section. And I hope that makes a lot of sense to you guys.